Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Katie, and I'm going to be presenting my research on curiosity learning and familiar characters. I want to give special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Kathleen Corriveau, and to everybody in the Social Learning Lab for supporting me in my project. This is Elmo. Elmo lives on Sesame Street. This is Bobo. Bobo is from a new show that no one has seen before. Who do children know more about, Elmo or Bobo? Who will they prefer to learn from? Who will they be more curious about? This is what I was looking to answer with my study. So first, I want to give some quick background about the fields of study that I am merging. There's a good amount of literature on curiosity that I'm going to be pulling from. First is the information gap theory, which refers to an awareness of an information gap or a deficit in knowledge, and it leads to an emotional, motivational feeling of curiosity and a desire to fill that gap. I'm also going to be using the optimal level of curiosity, which relates back to the information gap theory. So the easiest way to explain the optimal level of curiosity is with a U-shaped curve. So if you're at this end of the curve right here, this is where the information gap is largest, so you might not experience enough motivation to fill that gap and seek out more knowledge. However, as you travel up the curve, the information gap gets smaller and you get closer right up here to this optimal level of curiosity, which is where there's still enough of an information gap to motivate you to seek new information, but not so much that you aren't motivated at all. However, as you travel more down this end of the curve and the information gap gets smaller, you aren't motivated to seek out information because you already have it. And finally, I want to quickly discuss the state-based theory of curiosity, which refers to the conditions that somebody is in that motivates them to seek out information, rather than a trait-based theory of curiosity, which refers more to an innate trait that somebody is born with. And I am also using a scale that was developed from this to measure parents' conceptions of their children's curiosity. So next I want to quickly discuss some literature on familiar characters. So there have been studies that have found that children are more likely to prefer damaged objects with their favorite characters on it over non-damaged objects without their favorite characters, and that they are also more likely to ask a favorite character for information over an unfamiliar character. So now moving into my study, I was looking at investigating the relationship between curiosity, learning, and familiar fictional characters. So first, I wanted to look at curiosity. I was asking, will children exhibit more curiosity about a familiar or an unfamiliar character? I hypothesized that they would exhibit more curiosity about the familiar character. However, I also thought they might exhibit more curiosity about the unfamiliar character. I'm sorry, I went in the wrong order for those. I had two alternate hypotheses. And then to go into preference as an information source, I was asking who would they prefer as a source of information, the familiar or the unfamiliar character? And I thought that they would prefer the familiar character as a source of information. And finally, to go into learning, I wanted to ask who will they recall more information from? And I hypothesized that they would recall more information from the familiar character. So now going into my study, I introduced the child to Elmo and Bobo in a counterbalanced order, and I would ask them if they had seen both of them. I would say the same things that I said at the beginning of this presentation. Elmo lives on Sesame Street, Bobo is from a new show no one has seen before, and I would then ask them who they knew more about, Elmo or Bobo. So this served as a familiarity check and to ensure that they knew that they would know more about Elmo than Bobo. I then moved into the teaching trials, so I paired each animal with a character, and I would introduce them by saying, Elmo and Bobo want to teach you about some new animals. So I called this animal right here a hippolug, and I called this animal right here a zoopling. These are some hybrid animals that are adapted from another paper, so they are hybrids of familiar animals. They're not entirely novel. And the characters would also teach these 3 facts in addition to the animal's name. And then I would move into what I called the ask trials. So I would ask them these 4 questions, and afterwards I would ask them to justify why they had chosen Elmo or Bobo for each question. And this was to assess their preference for the characters as a source of information. Next, I moved into the curiosity trials. Just like the ask trials, I asked these 4 questions, and then I asked them to justify why they had chosen Elmo or Bobo for each question. In addition, I provided the answers to all these questions. So if they said they wanted to learn Elmo's favorite color, I told them Elmo's favorite color is red. And finally, I moved into the recall questions. So I would show one animal at a time on the screen in the order that they were taught, and I would ask them the 5 questions that are shown here. If at any point they said they didn't know, I would provide them with a forced choice question with both of the answers. So if they didn't remember what the animal was called, I would say, is it a hippolug or a zoopling? Sorry. In addition, I was also giving the parents a parent survey to fill out. This consisted of 10 questions, and each question was scored out of 4. So now moving into the results. I had a total of 45 participants. These were 4 and 5 years old, mean age being 59.16 months. 29 of these participants were female. 87% of them said they were familiar with Elmo. 4% said they were familiar with Bobo, even after being reminded sometimes multiple times that Bobo was from a new show that no one had seen before. However, 100% said that they knew more about Elmo than about Bobo. The curiosity scale was completed by 36 parents with a mean score of 28.92 out of 40, so there were 10 questions, each graded out of 4. It wasn't completed by everybody because it was emailed out to them separately to the study itself. So, for the Ask trials, I found that children were not significantly more likely to prefer Elmo or Bobo, so they were about the same in terms of asking them for the information. In curiosity, however, I found that children were significantly more likely to be curious about Elmo than about Bobo. So these were the individual means for my curiosity scales. As you can see, a higher average indicates a preference for Elmo, and these are all above 0.5. So for the recall trials, we had no effective informant, but we did have an effect of age, so they were more likely to recall more if they were older. And these are the means by informant. They're about even. So now moving into the discussion. So for the Ask trials, there was no significant difference in preference between characters. So there have been some previous studies that have found like there's a domain difference in an expert in a domain versus a familiar character, and that children were more likely to choose one or the other. However, we didn't see that, possibly because no character was identified as an expert in the domain in my study. Additionally, in terms of selective trust, there have been studies that have found that children prefer to ask a familiar character over an unfamiliar character, which I didn't find. However, this study did allow children to choose a favorite character from a list of characters, whereas we didn't. We didn't ask if Elmo was their favorite. We just said, do you know him? So next, who are children more curious about? They're more curious about Elmo. So this can go back to that optimal level of curiosity. Knowing some things about Elmo but not other things could push children far enough along that gradient that I referred to earlier to achieve this level. But Bobo might result in too large of a deficit of knowledge, too big of an information gap. Going back to this, Elmo might be right about here, Bobo could be right here. And who did children learn from? We didn't find an effective informant, which is consistent with prior findings that it didn't depend on the source, but rather the content. But older children did recall more content. So this could be developmental rather than familiarity driven. But this indicates that children can learn regardless of the source of information. Also, Elmo can be difficult to use in learning research because he's a naive character and doesn't usually know things, but children did learn from him. All right, thank you so much.
Awesome, any questions?
Hi, love this project, so awesome, just awesome work. I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts. What do you think it would look like to look at the curiosity of like 3-year-olds and also like 7-year-olds? I'm sure it was very intentional to pick like 4 and 5-year-olds, but I imagine curiosity really changes with the developmental differences between those ages, so I'm kind of curious if you have any like speculation there.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to look at. The reason we didn't go down to 3-year-olds was because we were doing the study over Zoom. So we were a little bit worried about like the ability to stay focused for a longer period of time over Zoom if they're younger. But I'd be interested to see like how that could like go. I'm sorry, how that could change as they go as we start looking at older children as well.
On that note, I have a question. So I never did research with like kids before. How difficult is it?
It kind of depends. Yeah, a lot of times it goes really well. Sometimes the study could take as little as 5 minutes. But yeah, it very much depends on the kid. Usually I found that it was pretty good. They were pretty easy to like stay focused. They were very engaged. Yeah.
I have to say, I am curious about Bobo. Did you invent him, or did he come from somewhere?
Yeah, so Bobo is actually a puppet that I made a couple of years ago for something completely different. But I happened to have a picture of him, and he looked Muppet-like enough to use in the study.
This is really great. So interesting. I was wondering if there might be, like, in terms of asking a character, wanting to learn more about a character, if there's any sort of, like, factor, not just of curiosity, but of, like, social appropriateness, of sort of, like, I mean, I feel like children of this age will talk to anyone, like, about anything. But I wonder, like, if when it comes into the literature or, like, your understanding of sort of, like, who is there another factor besides curiosity and trust that determine, like, who you might ask more about themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Something that we thought a lot about was character preference. So just, do they prefer Elmo? Do they like him more? Do they want to be friends with him? So that could have maybe played a factor in our curiosity findings.
Another question. I don't know if you mentioned this. Did you talk about, like, where you got your sample from, or, like, where these kids are from?
Yeah, so our sample, we recruited online. So our sample was just whoever responded to our emails from online. And the study was run over Zoom, so they didn't have to necessarily be in Boston for us to do the study.
I was just wondering what your, like, background is or inspiration was for the project.
Yeah. So I've been working in the social learning lab for about 2.5 years. I started off working on some other projects about curiosity under Hannah Petre, who's a PhD candidate. And then we've also been doing some other studies about familiar characters, not necessarily related to curiosity. So I was kind of looking at those two fields and wanting to merge them.
Super interesting, Katie. Thank you. I have two, but I'll start with the first one. What was the biggest surprise? Like, did you I know you had a couple different hypotheses, and some of them bore out and some of them did not. Were there other surprises? Like, did anybody want to introduce you to their own Elmo, or, like, run off screen, or any good stories about your participants?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, I think the main surprise was that, for me, it was at least that we didn't find that they preferred Elmo as a source of information. Just based on, like, the literature, we thought we would find that.
And then related to that, so what would you say the implications are? Like, does this have meaning for, children's television programs, or does it have meaning for how we think about curiosity in general? Like, where would you sort of see this going?
Yeah, I think the biggest implication is for children's educational media, because we didn't find that they needed a familiar character to, like, learn. Like, they can learn regardless of character. So you can put you can put any character in any world, and they will learn from them.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you.